She had not slept in 2 days. Emily Carter walked through the sliding glass doors of Nashville Memorial Hospital at 4:37 in the morning, carrying nothing but a faded blue duffel bag, a heart full of quiet courage, and the weight of 9 months spent entirely alone. The freezing rain outside had turned the streets into mirrors, and the wind cut through her coat like it had no intention of being kind. She moved slowly, one hand pressed gently against her swollen belly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold hospital air. The lobby was mostly empty at that hour. A few nurses moved behind the front desk. Somewhere down a long corridor, a television murmured to itself. Emily stood at the check-in counter and gave her name in a voice that was steady, even though everything inside her was not. The admitting nurse looked up with a warm, practiced smile and asked if her husband was parking the car. Emily shook her head once and said no. That was all. The nurse did not ask again. Emily Carter was 27 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that some silences are more honest than any explanation you could offer. She followed the nurse down the corridor without another word, past rooms where other women had arrived with husbands gripping overnight bags, with mothers holding their daughters' hands, with families gathered in clusters of nervous, joyful energy. She noticed it all. She noticed it the way you notice something you once believed would be yours and then one day realized would not. She breathed through it. She had become very good at breathing through things. 7 months earlier, the life she had imagined ended on a Tuesday afternoon. She had sat on the edge of the bed in their apartment and told him. She had practiced the words 100 times, but when the moment came, she simply said it plainly. The way you say something you hope with everything inside you will be received with love. He had gone very quiet. Then he had gotten up from the chair and walked out of the room. By the following morning, he was gone. No note, no call, nothing but an empty closet and a silence so complete it felt almost like a sound. She had called his number 11 times over the next 2 days before she stopped. She had sent 4 messages he never opened, and then, somewhere in the middle of the 3rd night, she made a decision that would define the months ahead. She dried her face, sat up straight in the dark, and decided that whatever came next, she was going to survive it. Not just for herself, for the child growing inside her who had done nothing wrong and deserved every good thing the world had to offer. She picked up extra shifts at a roadside diner on the edge of town. She worked mornings and she worked nights.
She smiled at strangers who never asked how she was doing and left tips she was grateful for, even when they were small. She assembled the crib herself one Saturday afternoon using a YouTube tutorial and a set of instructions written in 4 languages, none of them particularly clear. She painted the walls of the small spare room a soft pale yellow because yellow felt like hope, and hope was something she refused to surrender. Some nights she sat on the floor beside that crib with both hands resting on her stomach and whispered to the child inside her. She told him she was scared. She told him she was tired. And then she told him that none of that mattered because she was also going to be the best mother the world had ever seen, and that she would never, not for a single day of his life, allow him to feel the particular coldness of being left behind. Labor began just after sunrise on a Thursday morning in January. It lasted nearly 14 hours. The pain arrived in long, rolling waves that stove her breath and left her gripping the side rail of the hospital bed with both hands. Nurses cycled in and out, checking monitors, adjusting pillows, offering ice chips and encouragement in equal measure. One nurse, a soft-spoken woman named Diane, who had the kind of face that made you feel immediately safer, stayed closer than the others. She pressed a cool cloth to Emily's forehead during the hardest hours and spoke to her in a low, steady voice, telling her she was doing beautifully, that the body knows what it is doing, even when the mind is convinced otherwise. Emily held on to those words the way a person holds on to a rope in moving water. Outside the window, the January sky shifted slowly from gray to pale gold to gray again, and the storm that had followed her into the city continued rattling the glass as if reminding her that the world outside had not softened while she was in here learning what she was made of. And then, just past 7 o'clock in the evening, a sound filled the room that Emily Carter would hear for the rest of her life in her quietest and most grateful moments. A cry. Small and fierce and completely alive. A healthy baby boy had arrived in the world, and he announced himself with the full force of someone who intended to be known. Emily fell back against the pillow, tears moving freely down her face, and she laughed and wept at the same time, in the way that only happens when relief and love and exhaustion arrive together all at once. The nurses moved with efficient tenderness around her, and someone placed the baby against her chest.
And for a long moment, there was nothing in the world but the warmth of that tiny body and the sound of her own heartbeat telling her that they had made it. She pressed her lips to the top of his head and breathed him in and whispered his name for the first time out loud, Noah. She had chosen it months ago, on a night when she had opened her Bible looking for something to hold on to, and the story of a man who built something strong enough to survive the flood had reached off the page and found her. It was during the routine examination that followed, in those ordinary minutes when nurses moved quietly and charts were updated and the room exhaled into its calmer rhythm, that Dr. William Harper came in. He was 63 years old, a man whose face carried the particular kind of stillness that comes from decades of standing in rooms where the stakes are highest. He had delivered somewhere near 4,000 babies over the course of his career. He had seen every possible variation of joy and grief that a delivery room could hold. He moved with a calm so practiced it had become indistinguishable from his natural state. And when he entered a room, the room settled around him the way water settles after a stone has passed through it. He picked up Emily's chart, reviewed it with quiet efficiency, and then turned toward the examination table where the nurses were completing their assessment of the newborn. He looked at the baby, and then he stopped. Not the way a person stops when they are surprised by something pleasant. He stopped the way a person stops when something reaches inside them and seizes hold of a part of them they had believed was no longer capable of being reached. The color drained from his face so completely that Nurse Diane took a half step toward him, her hand rising slightly, as though she might need to steady him. He did not notice. He was looking at a small crescent-shaped birthmark just beneath the baby's right ear, so small that most people would have looked past it entirely, a mark no larger than a thumbnail and nearly the same soft brown as the child's warm skin. Dr. Harper had seen that mark before. He had seen it on his father's neck in an old photograph taken sometime in the 1950s. He had seen it on his own neck in every mirror of his adult life. He had seen it on his son's neck the last morning they had spent in the same room together 3 years ago, before the door closed between them and neither of them had found the courage to open it again. The room felt very far away.
He set the chart down on the counter with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who was using a small physical task to anchor himself to the present moment. Then he turned to Emily, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard it. He asked her a question, a name, and Emily, confused and exhausted and still raw from 14 hours of labor, answered him honestly, Ryan Harper. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. Dr. William Harper looked at the woman in the hospital bed. He looked at the child on the examination table, and for the first time in 40 years of medicine, he had absolutely no idea what to say. The nurses understood, in the way that nurses often understand things before words are spoken, that something had shifted in the room that had nothing to do with medicine. They gave what privacy the space allowed, and slowly, across the next hour, in the halting and incomplete way that two people begin to share the weight of a truth neither of them was prepared for. Emily and Dr. Harper began to talk. She told him about the Tuesday afternoon, about the unanswered calls, about the crib she had assembled alone, and the yellow walls and the shifts at the diner and the nights on the floor speaking to a child who could not yet hear her. She told him all of it without bitterness, only with the quiet, exhausted honesty of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally arrived at a place where setting it down seems possible. Dr. Harper listened to every word, and then he told her about his son. He told her about the years of distance that had grown between them like something neither of them had planted, but neither had thought to uproot until it was too large to easily remove. He told her about the arguments rooted in pride on both sides. He told her about his wife, Margaret, who had spent the last year of her life leaving the porch light on every single night because she believed with everything inside her that Ryan would come home, and who died 14 months ago in a room not far from this one, still believing it. He told Emily that he had not spoken to his son in 3 years, and that the silence between them had become its own kind of grief, the particular grief of mourning someone who is still alive, but unreachable. When he finished, neither of them spoke for a while. Then Dr. Harper asked if he could hold the baby. Emily looked at this man, this stranger who was not quite a stranger, this grandfather who had arrived without warning in the most ordinary and extraordinary way, and she nodded.
He lifted Noah with the practiced gentleness of a man who had held thousands of newborns, but his hands trembled slightly in a way they never had before. He looked down into the baby's face and saw the traces of people he had loved. He saw Margaret in the shape of the brow. He saw his own father in the set of the chin, and he saw Ryan, the boy he had raised, the young man he had lost, somewhere in the dark and searching eyes looking up at him. He held that child for a long time without speaking, and when the tears finally came, he did not try to stop them, which was remarkable for a man who had trained himself across an entire career never to cry in a hospital room. He visited them before they were discharged. He visited them the week after they came home. He showed up with groceries and a portable heater for the drafty corner of Emily's apartment and an infant car seat he had researched carefully because he had read 4 different consumer reviews before deciding on the safest one. He did not announce himself as anything. He did not make promises he was not certain he could keep. He simply showed up, consistently and without drama. And for Emily, who had learned what abandonment felt like at its sharpest, consistency was the most profound kindness anyone had offered her in years. But there was still Ryan. It took Dr. Harper 2 months to find him. He was living in a small apartment outside of Louisville, working a warehouse job he had started 3 weeks before, trying in his own quiet way to rebuild a life that had come apart at the seams in ways he had never fully admitted to anyone, including himself. His father sent him a single photograph, no message, no demand, no long letter full of everything that had been left unsaid between them, just a photograph of a newborn baby sleeping on his side in a white hospital blanket with a faint crescent birthmark just below his right ear. Ryan looked at that photograph for a long time. He sat at his kitchen table in the early morning dark and looked at it until the light changed around him and the sounds of the neighborhood began to wake up outside his window. He had spent years telling himself that the choices he had made were survivable, that the people he had hurt would find their way without him, that distance was sometimes the kindest thing a person could offer when they believed themselves to be too broken to be good for anyone. The photograph made none of that possible to believe anymore. That was his son, a real child, a boy with his family's mark on his skin and Emily's courage already written into the very fact of his existence, a little boy growing up in a world Ryan had chosen to absent himself from. He drove to Nashville on a Sunday morning in April.
He stood outside Emily's apartment door, holding a small stuffed elephant he had bought at a drugstore on the way, because he had no idea what else to bring, and his hands needed something to hold. He stood there for several minutes before he knocked. When the door opened and Emily stood before him, neither of them spoke immediately. There was too much between them for words to arrive quickly. Some of it was pain, some of it was shame, some of it was the particular, complicated grief of two people who had once loved each other and then lost the thread of it in the worst possible way. Emily stepped back and let him in. She did not forgive him in that moment. Real forgiveness does not arrive like a weather event. It comes slowly, the way seasons change, almost imperceptibly at first, and then all at once, when you look up one day and realize the world around you is different from what it was. What she gave him that morning was something smaller and perhaps more honest than forgiveness. She gave him the chance to try. Ryan walked to the crib in the corner of the pale yellow room. He knelt down beside it. Noah was awake, his dark eyes moving with the unfocused, earnest attention of a 4-month-old discovering that the world is full of faces worth looking at. Ryan leaned in close, and the baby regarded him with the complete and uncomplicated openness that only very young children possess, the openness that exists before the world has taught them to be careful. Then Noah reached out one small hand, the fingers curled softly, and found Ryan's finger and held on. Ryan bowed his head over that tiny hand and wept. Not because the past had been erased, it had not. Not because everything was repaired, it was not. But because in the grip of that small hand, he understood for the first time with absolute clarity what he had almost walked away from forever, and the understanding of it broke him open in a way that for the first time in a very long time felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. In the years that followed, Noah Carter grew up surrounded by people who chose to stay. A grandfather who never once missed a birthday, who taught him to fish on summer mornings and read to him from old books on rainy afternoons and showed up to every school play in the 3rd row with his program folded carefully in his lap. A mother whose strength was the bedrock of everything, the kind of quiet, unshakable strength that does not announce itself but is always there when you reach for it. And a father who spent the rest of his life earning the trust of the two people he had once abandoned, slowly and imperfectly, and with the particular determination of someone who finally understands what love actually costs. Noah would never remember the storm that raged outside the hospital window the night he was born. He would never remember the freezing rain, or the empty waiting room, or the tears that fell
in that delivery room from more than one set of eyes. But he would grow up knowing, in the wordless and bone-deep way that children absorb the truths of their earliest years, that he was wanted, that he was cherished, that the people around him had made hard choices and faced hard mornings and crossed long distances because he was worth every bit of it. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was low and Noah was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime stillness, Emily would sit in the pale yellow room and think about the night she had walked into that hospital alone, carrying everything on her own shoulders, convinced that alone was all there was going to be. And she would feel, rising up through the exhaustion and the memory and the long road it had taken to get from there to here, something she had almost stopped believing in. Something that had survived everything thrown against it. Something that had begun impossibly in a hospital room at 4:37 in the morning when a doctor looked at a newborn child and recognized something he had been missing for a very long time. It was the feeling that broken things, given enough love and enough time and enough courage, can find their way back to whole.
If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that love is worth fighting for, even when the road is long, please take a moment to subscribe to the Kind Soul Stories. Every week, we bring you true-to-life stories of ordinary people living with extraordinary grace. Hit the bell so you never miss one. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like this today, share it with them. You never know whose heart is waiting for exactly these words. This story carries several layers of genuine value for viewers. It speaks honestly about single parenthood and the silent strength required to raise a child alone, without bitterness or self-pity, offering quiet encouragement to anyone walking that road. It explores the consequences of abandonment, not with anger, but with the kind of honest emotional clarity that invites reflection rather than judgment, making it valuable for younger viewers who may be facing similar decisions. It illustrates the lasting damage of pride and estrangement within families, and how the cost of silence between people who love each other is measured in years that cannot be recovered. It shows that reconciliation is possible even after deep hurt, but that it requires humility, consistency, and time rather than a single dramatic gesture. It honors the role of grandparents as bridges between broken generations. And above all, it reminds every viewer who has ever felt abandoned, overlooked, or alone that their story is not finished, and that love, when it is genuine, has a way of finding its way back, even through the longest winters.